I'm pleased to welcome you to the second Winter 24 event in the Faculty Professional Development Series, hosted in partnership with Educational Technology and Innovation. Our speakers today, Dr. Brandi Robinson and Eleanor Oakes, will be discussing what universal design for learning is and how to utilize it in the classroom. Educational Technology and Innovation Senior Instruction Designer, Dr. Brandi Robinson, received her BS from the University of Tennessee at Martin, her MA from the University of New Orleans, and her Ed.D. from Liberty University. She's taught math at all levels, including graduate, and received the 2020 Faculty of the Year Award from the American Women's College for her work in the mathematics department. Assistant Professor of Photography Eleanor Oakes received her BA from Princeton University and her MFA from Stanford University, and is the founder of Darkroom Detroit, a local nonprofit that increases access to photography and visual literacy. In 2016, she was awarded the Applebaum Emerging Artist Resident at Pony Ride, Detroit, where she completed the collaborative public art project Graffiti Wanted. She's also the recipient of numerous awards, including a 2023 Flourish Fund grant from Culture Source and the Andy Warhol Foundation, and a Murphy and Cadogan Contemporary Art Award from the San Francisco Foundation. I think I may have mispronounced that, but we're rolling with it. So anyway, super excited to have you both here to talk to us about universal design for learning. And take it away, Brandi.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am going to talk about universal design for learning and the three principles that it encompasses, and we'll highlight a couple of examples. And so essentially, when we talk about universal design for learning, it's just thinking about everyone from the start of your design process and not going back at the end of designing something or at the end of creating your course and then trying to figure it out. So it's if you load it on the front end, it's a lot easier as you move through it. And so what it is there's a framework, and it's made to really maximize your impact across students of all abilities, across students of all learning preferences, and hitting as many of those learners' needs as you can and differences. And as a result, because you're rippling across different abilities, you're rippling across different learning preferences, it makes your content more accessible. So it also impacts your accessibility just because you're thinking a little bit in advance on how we can really aid learners. And so within it, there's three primary principles. And the first principle that they say to follow is just having multiple means of representation. And all that really means is having different things in your class. So you might think of having a video show your content, and then you might think of also having some text. So if you're doing a demonstration, you may have a Zoom recording or a recording of your demonstration. And then you might want to just have a page where you're explaining it and writing for learners who don't really tend to follow videos well. I know a lot of people tend to prefer videos. I'm one of the rare ones that doesn't. I really need to see text on the page. So I'm always really cognizant when I'm building my courses to make sure that I have both, because my learning preference is reading and not auditory or visual components like that. Another piece of, as you're thinking about representation and multiple means of it, is thinking about using plain language and what's easy for students to understand if they're coming from different backgrounds, cultures, or linguistics. And so having really simple language usage, avoiding those euphemisms, like, if I'm down here in the South, I'm going to say y'all. If I say that in a classroom for people who aren't in the South, they don't really know what that word means. So you want to try to use general broad phrases that wouldn't confuse learners who may not be native speakers or be coming from different cultures. And then also when you're representing your content in your course, you just want to think a little bit around their background knowledge, and you want to give some context before you launch into something. So what I try to do is connect it to something the students know previously. So in the math field, I try to connect as much as I can to finances or everyday life, and then launch into my materials so that there's some connection with the content that I'm trying to represent. And by doing this, we're just really hitting all those learner preferences. We're making sure that we're thinking ahead of time about language difficulties, reading capabilities, and all of those components in representation. And multiple means of action and expression is probably my favorite part of the framework. I am a faculty member who really loves students taking a project and running with it on their own twist, because inevitably it comes out way better than what I ever thought it would be. And so when we're allowing multiple means of action and expression, we're allowing them to interact with the content where they have some choice. And so, what that choice might look like is allowing students to record a video of them presenting something versus writing a paper, allowing them to pick the topic that they're going to create an illustration about. Anytime they have some choice in those assessments, we really see an increase in their action and their expression of their knowledge. Another key piece just to think about is, as you're thinking of action and expression, based on their abilities or the areas that they identify as their strengths, this also lets them really play to those, and you're going to see a lot better quality coming from your students' work products. And one of the things that I did in my mathematical art class that I taught here at CCS was I would develop a framework for projects, but I would say, I'm just looking to see these three principles of mathematics represented in your final product, but it could be a fashion piece, it could be a transportation. So I had students who made floral patterns using polar equations to create their own fabrics. I had students who created a purse. It was phenomenal. And the purse was in the shape of a polar graph. And I had a student draw a car, and the car had all these really nice curved features that were from that type of equation. And so by letting them run with it a little bit on their own and put their own twist and their own flavor on it, I really saw a lot more of it, a lot stronger expression of their understanding of math within different ways. And the other key piece really for this is, before you can let the student run and put their own twist on it, they have to really be scaffolded to be able to do it. So when you're thinking in your course, you always want to think about the project that you're expecting the student to complete. Did they do some practice in some form of each of those steps with you as a guide? And so when we're thinking about scaffolding, that's what we mean is we want to start by practicing the skill a couple of times and then having that critical assessment happen that's graded, but giving them the chance, I say the chance to skin your knees before you do the final project, because we always skin our knees when we're trying a new project. And same as, if you're physically on a bike, the first time you ride it, you're going to have a mistake and you're going to learn from it. So having those scaffolded practice opportunities just allows them to make mistakes and it be okay and not critical within their grades, so they can really actively learn from it. And then engagement again talks about making choices. So a lot of UDL is really just allowing for choice within the learners as much as we can within our fields. There's obviously things that students are going to have to do in your classroom. They're going to have to use a particular software. They're going to have to demonstrate certain skills. But the more we can offer them choices with demonstrating their knowledge and making it relevant to them, the better that they're able to succeed in your course. And so again, giving them the opportunities to adapt, not just on how they're assessed, but also how the content is represented and also how they're engaging directly with the content, is really helpful for learners. And so that's my very quick run through of Universal Design for Learning. There are a couple of key benefits that I just kind of added to this slide, and it really just speaks to things that I think CCS does a phenomenal job at. As a whole, we're very aware of the differences in our learners. We encourage individuality. All of the things that we're doing in our community are already lending themselves to UDL. So I really enjoy working at a place who is learner centered and learner first. And we're always trying to think of that. And it also reduces barriers. And that's one of the things that I also love seeing here is there's so many supports with technology. There are so many supports with faculty. There's so many opportunities for students to exhibit their work, that we're really taking the barriers out of the learning process and providing such a high quality engagement for our students. And we're also providing equal access. There's so many programs here that I've learned about as I've been developing courses, that are really giving students opportunities to reach out for help in areas that they need it, and faculty that are really willing to go the extra mile and really focus on giving detailed feedback so that students grow here. So these are all benefits that I see of UDL, but these are also all benefits that I see us practicing at CCS. every day that we come in. And that is my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brandi. That gives us a great understanding of what Eleanor is going to talk to us about. So Eleanor is going to talk to us about how she uses UDL principles in the classroom, and then we'll have time for Q&A afterwards.
All right, thank you. That was so awesome. And a perfect lead-in. As you can see, I got a little too excited about UDL when I was designing my presentation. But I also tried to put some resources in here for everybody, so I'd be very happy to share the link to this presentation afterwards if anybody would like to kind of review some of these things for themselves. I'm going to start really just thinking about these like kind of main tenets. Sorry, let me put you all on the side so I can see a little bit better. These main tenets that Brandi already covered, which is great because I can be faster about it, but I think they really all interconnect, right? These three kind of main tenets that I think of for UDL are recognizing that all learners are unique. So, as humans, we are all different. We all come to the classroom with our own set of life experiences, preferences, learning preferences, and really trying to recognize that individuality between all of us. Also tying into accessibility, as Brandi was talking about, in terms of how we're representing the material and making sure that it is accessible for all individuals in the classroom. And then also how it really underlines student-centered and a student-centered pedagogy. Again, really putting the student first to dictate what their learning journey is going to be, rather than us as educators dictating that journey. Scaffolding, again, is really important. That support is really important, but I want them to be able to lead and follow their own interests. So let me just get this moving here. Oh, okay. So I'm not going to go over these because Brandi already did, but these are some great worksheets from CAST that I put in here that I'm happy to share as part of this presentation that I think helps when you're thinking about how to make your own classes a little bit more centered in UDL. They're really, I find them very helpful. And then also this resource about a comprehensive faculty development guide for course accessibility, because I think that's something that all of us through Canvas need to continue working on, just in terms of how we're making that content more accessible. So this is a really great template in terms of links to other resources and how you can make your content more accessible. But let's kind of go back to this idea of UDL. And I'm going to actually take three different approaches rather than the engagement, representation, and action and expression. When I'm thinking about designing my studio courses, I find there's three different ones out of Cornell University that I find really helpful, and that's different options for perception, different options for comprehension, and different options for expression. So very similar in how we're approaching it, but in my mind, it kind of helps me clarify how I'm moving through the material a little bit more. So let's start in that student-centered approach. And I think that there's ways when I'm setting up a class, both in the beginning and then throughout the semester, that I'm having check-ins. So in the beginning of the semester, I'm always starting our classes with our shared goals. So what are your goals as a student entering this class? Just going around and simply saying them. And if it's like, this class is required for me, that's totally fine. But I want them to be honest and tell me that so that I know where they're coming from. I find that particularly when I have a class that has different majors in it, they all have very different goals for the course or things that they're trying to underline in their learning in their major. So it's really helpful for me to know that in the onset so that I can think about what material I could maybe add or adjust that would help them get to that goal that they want to see in a different medium. Community agreements are really helpful. This is an example of one that I made with students last year, where they all are responsible for going around the room and deciding as a group, what do they want to commit to for the semester? So what do they expect from themselves and their classmates, but also then what do they expect from me as their instructor? And this, I kind of we create together. Everybody has to vote on all of these things so that everybody is on board with everything that's written on the board. But then it's kind of like our informal contract, right? Of hey, you said you were going to present yourself professionally this semester, but you were 15 minutes late to the midterm review. Like, hello, we need to like come back to our community agreement. And it sets up a lot of accountability for the students, for themselves, and also then for me as their instructor too. And then just throughout the course of the semester, making sure you're having these touch points for student feedback. So, I'll have very candid conversations with my students like, hey, how's everybody doing? How are we doing with class load? How are the courses going? Your assignments for this course or other courses, let's talk about it. And sometimes it's all great, but sometimes there's a lot of struggle points. And we'll talk through those. And, maybe I realized from that, okay, if you're all really struggling with ideating for this assignment, let me give you more resources, right? Having an open line of communication is really, really important. Another great way to do that is a start, stop, continue survey, which can be very casually done. It's 3 questions sent out to the students, maybe week 4, 5, 6. And it's, what is not happening in class that you need to start happening in class? What's happening in class that you want to see stop, that's not helpful for you or productive for you? And then what's working that you want to see continue? Really, really basic, just open form questions to get feedback if you want to kind of really know what playing field everybody is on. So going back to these tenets of from Cornell, I thought I would form them mostly around this one particular class I teach, which is advanced photographic forms. And this class is really great because I work in photography and most of my students want to make these nice little flat photographs. But this class makes them all make something that is not a flat photograph. They have to make photographic sculpture, they have to do installation and performance, and it really challenges them outside of the bounds of their comfort levels or their experience. So going back to providing different options for perception, right? Let's start with this first tenet. One of the main ways I do this is providing resources through Canvas. And Canvas is so great and so accessible in how it works that you're able to do this really beautifully. And I really try and provide content in a variety of different formats, as Brandi was saying. So here's an example. This is actually from a slightly different class. This is another junior class that's their junior project. But looking at week 3, you can see that I have an assignment given to them as their first photo set, but then they're also required to read an article about photographer Wendy Redstar. They're required to visually review her website. So look at all of that content for themselves. And I ask them to look at individual portfolios, again, read her artist statement that's posted there, and then also listen to an interview with her on the Photo Work podcast. So there's 3 different ways that they're engaging with this one artist's work for 1 week. None of these things are long. The podcast is great because I'm like, you guys can listen to that while you edit your photos, right? Like you can kind of multitask a little bit. But I find that it creates really robust conversations because some students take more away from the reading. Some students take more away from visually reviewing the work, and others take more away from listening to an interview. But they've all done all of it. So they all have the same context coming to that conversation. Other ways that you can provide, more kind of scaffolding through Canvas, particularly, I really am big on sending out weekly announcement reminders of what they need to do that week. I find that, it's a little bit of hand-holding, but I find that it goes a really long way in having them be prepared for class. And it's not a big effort on my part. It's like 1 sentence. I can even send it out like the day before class if I have to. But I'm just saying, this is what's expected of you for this class. I expect you to be there on time, and I expect you to bring the materials that you need to have. Other things, like, again, thinking about a multi-sensory approach. So oral resources, things like podcasts, interviews, even music. So like I tried today to start with a little bit of Debussy as an example, but like, for let's say my Black and White 2 class, when we're studying pictorialism, I'm trying to give them the contents of that art movement, in photography, in connection to painting, and then also, let's say, in connection to the music that was happening at the day. So as everybody's filtering in, I'll have, musicians of the time playing so that we can factor that into our context of the discussion that we're having around a particular historical era. Let's see here. The other thing too, like with written resources, right? Thinking about the wide variety of written resources you can add. So Critical readings are important, but also I'll include poetry, prose, again, interviews, artist statements that were written by the artist, maybe exhibition reviews that were written by an outside party about the artist, and also providing different opinions is super important. So here you'll see, like on this far right side, when we're studying Deanna Lawson, I'll give a reading on the same week, one that is pro Deanna Lawson and is really about the importance and cultural significance of her work, and then another that finds her work really problematic. And I want the students to read both of those pieces, look at the work themselves, and come to their own, opinions about the work. I think it's really important to remember that when we're teaching, we're not trying to impose our own views on students. We're trying to give them information so that they can form their own views and opinions. How am I doing on time, Amy? I have 5 minutes, maybe.
You are doing great. You've only spent 9.
Perfect. Okay. So, another thing that I found really helpful during COVID is something I've kept, which is providing tutorials online. So whereas I felt like I used to pre-COVID do a lot of those tutorials and demonstrations only in class, I've now taped all of them, and I have this really bust resource of online tutorials, virtual tutorials that they can watch rather. And I feed that into a flipped classroom model, which I'm going to talk about in the next point. Outside of online lives, right, in person, bringing in guest visitors is really important. Maybe going on field trips to see other people in their context of their studio. Mentorship is huge, right? Mentorship from me as their teacher or internal mentor, but I'm also really, really a fan of connecting students to other mentors who might have similar interests, similar backgrounds, similar goals. Those could be both internal or external. And I've had some really beautiful experiences having students with external mentors who are just an added mentor. I might still mentor them, but I have an old colleague from New York, and she is the head of film and photography at NARS, the cosmetic brand. And she just loves mentoring students because it's something that she can do outside of corporate America that she finds really fulfilling. And she never asks for payment. I would love to pay lots of people to be lots of mentors for our students, but in a perfect world, but she's not interested in any sort of financial reward for it. She just finds the experience and the relationship that she creates with those students really meaningful. So every year she mentors a different student in our department. And she picks who she wants to mentor, which is great. But kind of finding more relationships like that so that students aren't just hearing the same opinions from our internal CCS voices, but also from people in industry or who are practicing artists. Same thing, getting out of the classroom is so important, right? Like our classrooms are beautiful, our facilities are beautiful here, but it's so, so important to see how what they're learning applies in the real world. And so field trips are great for that. But I also often do a development trip every year where we go to New York, or once we went to LA. And the students come back from that with such a crystallized understanding of what's available to them in the world. They will have met so many new people. You can see these little, let me go in our pictures here. On the left is students at Chris Graves Projects, which is a publishing house in Queens. And Chris loaded them all up with like 40 pounds of books each free to take home. And we were elated, but also how are we fitting these in our suitcases? Then also we've been on the stage at Pier 59 Studios, and this was last year when they just opened their first 360-degree studio. It's the only one, I think, in the world that exists. And, the folks on set there were just happy to stay late and give them a tour of this set. So the students see how their career paths can actually manifest in the real world, which brings them back more energized than ever and more motivated than ever. All of these things are really about providing these layered contexts to what they're studying and relationship to the subject matter that they're studying. So providing different options for comprehension, and I won't go over all of these because of time, but again, I think like this flipped classroom model gives a lot of flexibility in how we're teaching. Same thing with extra credit opportunities. I'm a really big fan of extra credit opportunities. I think that if I need to give students 5 points extra credit on an assignment to get them to go see a Woodward lecture or come to one of our lunchbox talks, I'm totally fine with that because that is them engaging with a new voice, them seeing new work that they haven't seen before. And I think that it's a real benefit to them. The other way I use it a lot is, again, this is this forms class, and we cover a lot of techniques in this class. And some are mandatory, but there's so many other things that we could be doing, so many other techniques that we could be experimenting with, that I want them to feel like they have flexibility in that learning. So you'll see here the blue rectangles are how I'm doing a flipped classroom model. So that's where I'm giving them as homework a lecture to watch and a demonstration to watch on the history and practical making of a technique that we're going to do in class the next week. And then you'll also see in the yellow ovals extra credit. So I have additional tutorials that are not required online for them to watch. And if they want extra credit, they can make an image in that process. They can use that technique to make a piece that they submit for extra credit. And for the final in this class, they can make a project that's in any of the techniques we've studied, or if they want to research a new one, great. But it gives them so much flexibility in how they're studying. And if there's a student who's highly, highly motivated, it creates a lot of room for them to go and above and beyond. But it also, creates space for students who are just trying to get through this as a required class, to still do well, right? So it's rewarding to students who are motivated. And then the one at the bottom, you'll see the oval at the bottom, it says 1 ink aid or fabric print due. So again, I'm giving like an option to students where I'm presenting them 2 different techniques and I'm saying whichever one of these you're into more, go ahead, work in that and turn that in, right? So it's again, choices, which Brandi went over really beautifully. Here, if I can get out of my boxes. Group feedback is so important, and that can be as the class or it can be in smaller groups. I do a lot of things with my students where they're working in progress. So things like bringing in an artist statement, and everybody will have to bring it in printed. And we'll take some time silently to pass our artist statements to each other in a circle and do a written response first. Maybe we're checking for typos or highlighting sentences that do or don't work, but we're also then writing at the bottom a quick written response to that statement. And then once we get back to the reset, we'll have a verbal discussion about those statements too. I do a very similar thing in my critiques of visual work, where I often ask students to start with written responses. Sometimes I cue them, sometimes they're open, but this way I know that all students have written something about each other's work. And then when we're going and talking about critiques, I don't have any problems calling on people, right? Because I know they have something to say. I know that they, have already considered, the work. And even then, if not everybody gets to talk, that student gets all of that written feedback to take home and digest later. So students who aren't super comfortable in vocal critiques still are giving their feedback to their colleagues, which is super important. Additionally, just again, in that mentorship model, individual meetings, whether that be in person or Zoom, experiential learning through sponsored projects and internships. And then finally getting to our last one before Amy pulls the hook on me. I really believe in making everybody uncomfortable in the classroom. I think that there can be a misconception where UDL is to make everybody comfortable, but I actually kind of love the idea of the opposite, of making everybody uncomfortable and giving them the options to find their own footing, right? Again, scaffolding that learning, but they need to be pushed to try new things, to fail, to experiment. And this also really challenges them to be, I think, like independently motivated researchers, right? We skipped a slide here. But encouraging students to innovate and solve new challenges and be able to find the answers for themselves rather than having the answers given to them. I also think it's so important to redefine productivity. and understand that like a portfolio piece product is not going to be the final result of every class. Some classes are these like learning blocks and these learning stages to get to the next step. You have to kind of have that experience of failure for a student to be able to build themselves up with, again, help and assistance. But I think, you know, students just through this experimental forms class develop such an amazing relationship with their own work, with themselves, and also with each other. For an example, you know, last year, or rather last semester, one student did a performance where she created a safe space in one of our studios. We all sat in a circle together with pillows and blankets, and she passed around her personal journal for each of us to read one page aloud of her personal journal. And by the end, like almost everybody was in tears. We were all crying about how she treated herself, which was not very kindly. You know, it created a lot of empathy with each other, for us, for her. It was a really, really beautiful experience, and she's now continuing to make work in that realm. Finally, just, you know, remembering to present opportunities for students to display and finalize their work, whether that's through exhibitions, whether that's through performances, and, you know, encouraging them to find external and internal opportunities. Another student from this course made a beautiful piece, installation, performance about Ukrainian genocide. This was before the war, contemporary war. But that war actually broke out over the course of that semester, which was really strange. And that work was submitted to and accepted in an international studies festival. So she later re-performed over the summer that piece in a public venue and an international stage. So, you know, even though we're not trying to define productivity as a portfolio piece, in some cases it can be, right? But really thinking that like the experience and the journey can be just as much of the product as anything else. And here I just wanted to end with a couple like examples of the diversity of the work that comes out of this class. You know, whether you would think all of these are photographs or not, I don't know. One's a video piece here, one's an anthotype made out of plants, one's a CNC wood portrait with fiberglass install, a 3D printed lithophane, and an image transferred onto rock of rock climbing, right? So these are just a very small handful of examples, but I can't, you know, say how much this is meant to me to see students blossom so much through, again, this challenging nature that is supportive and accessible and very student-centric, and how much it works in the classroom. I'm done. Tap me out.
My goodness, thank you so much, Eleanor. That was incredible. I know it's given me a lot of ideas. I'm sure others as well. That's really incredible. Thank you. We do have some time for questions. We do have a couple of comments in the chat. So Carl shared the udlguidelines.cas.org, which I think you were also referencing, Eleanor. And also Ashley was just really appreciating the use of the Miro board. But then Ian was saying, do you encounter resistance to reading tasks?
Ian, just to clarify, when you say reading tasks, do you mean just like assignments of reading?
I mean, yes, to the volume of reading.
No, never. And to be clear, like I don't assign a huge amount of reading. I usually, you know, even though there might look like there's 2 articles, they're not voluminous. They're not incredibly long. They're pretty digestible, especially over the course of when I tend to assign them. There tends to be, you know, it's not right before like a midterm project is due, right? Like I try and pace it so that it feels more manageable. But they always do all of the reading, and then I also always often rather include optional readings too, so that if students really enjoyed a particular reading, they could actually read more if they wanted to.
Good to know. Thanks.
That's really phenomenal. Thank you. If there's anyone who has questions, please feel free to put it in the chat, raise your hand. I do have a couple of questions for you. So how how do you design your curriculum to accommodate diverse ways of learning and engagement simultaneously? So I think you got to this a little bit with like the various types of materials that you provide for them to go through. But is there more to that?
Is this for me or for Brandi?
Either.
Brandi, do you want to go first? I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, so basically, Amy, you're asking about what was your question again? You cut out whenever
Oh, sorry. So, how do you accommodate diverse ways of learning and create that engagement simultaneously? So different learning needs at the same time.
I mean, so the first thing I start with is my content for the week, and being how I teach, I typically will provide a video. And what I try to do in my videos, and again, I'm in the math world, but even in like in my mathematical art class, what I did was I would create a lecture video using this interface called Desmos, and I would also provide the link to an applet for Desmos where students could live move it along with me, kind of like if you were given a demonstration of like Adobe Photoshop, students could open it. So in the videos, it's kind of doing that and it's pausing. And there's also information that'll pop up on the screen as I'm paused for those who prefer to read. And then I also make sure that I have captions and a transcript. And then what I typically do on the next page is I summarize what was in the video. And sometimes I'll provide what I call explore more. And that'll be an activity where they can basically do something similar to the video, but without having to follow along with me. So basically learners get the same experience, whether they're looking at the text page or the video. So that's one of the pieces that I think about from a content perspective for people that have learning preferences. And then one thing that I'm constantly aware of with that is also making sure that it's readable for students with UDL. So it's got to be plain language. It's got to have all the accessibility features. So we have to alt text and pieces like that. But that's kind of my starting point is I start with the content of what I'm building and having multiple ways to represent that content. And then I will layer that into having interactive things that they can choose to engage with, like the explore more piece. And then in the assessment, I try to also have different ways for them to engage with the instruction sets. So that's kind of where I start. For me, it always like I know what I'm doing for the assessment, but it's fleshing the content out that helps me kind of get the multiple ways of representing things.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, when you say curriculum, Amy, are you referencing something more than one class, or are you saying within one given class?
Within one class specifically.
I mean, I think that that's like through the syllabus or is like some of the ideas already of like these multiple different means of representation. But I think that's also like where I really love being here is our class size, right? Because I think individual attention is like an unparalleled resource, right? And if I'm teaching in a lecture hall with 200 people, there's a limit to that connection. But if I have 15, 20 students gets high, but like, if I have under 20 students, I can touch base with all those students individually, right? And so individual meetings, again, like being available, I find really important. Checking in with students. There's almost no classes where I don't have some sort of individual meeting structure as a course block so that I can make room to touch base with them individually and see how the class is progressing for them, what their struggles are, what they're succeeding at. The other thing that Brandi mentioned in terms of credit and grading is I also, for all of my studio classes where a visual assignment is being submitted, I always make sure to give credit for conceptual development. So if a student has worked, again, like trying to not develop this fear of failure, right? If a student has worked incredibly hard, like, they really thought through what they wanted to make, and it's really complicated and it's so in depth, like sometimes those students will try and make something, but it's so complicated and in depth that the first time they do it, like it's bad. Like it's not like, they don't have the time, they might really not make something great the first time they try something because it's new. And so making sure that they get points for that conceptual development, like if you can stand up and talk to me about all of these intricate ideas you had leading up to your project, I am absolutely going to give you credit for that, right? Like maybe the end fell flat because you hadn't worked in this process before, but then they are encouraged by those points for conceptual development to go back and try the process again.
Wow, incredible. Thank you. So much thought from both of you goes into this. Do we have any questions from the audience, perchance? Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we do have that space. Also, Carl, are you available? I know that I had contacted you in advance of this lecture, and you had some really great points, like about how learning styles are perhaps we're moving past learning styles. So if you have anything to add on that topic, I'd really love to hear if you're there.
Oh, thanks, Amy. No, I appreciate what was brought up today in terms of the multiple approaches. What I was sharing in terms of learning styles is that and I didn't hear that today. I know it's brought up in term, but in terms of that we may be visual learners, or we may have a certain learning preference, but drilling towards that preference and only teaching towards that preference could actually be harmful. And what I'm hearing today is the opposite of that. I was providing multiple opportunities and ways to learn and ways to represent information and different experiences and voices. So I really appreciate what I've heard today, that that counters that that potential effect there. So that's, yeah, in a previous discussion I know Amy and I had, I am cautious in terms of learning or using the term learning styles and how it was previously interpreted.
Wonderful, thank you. Amy Roop said in the chat that agreeing with discomfort, since that's where the real growth happens. So we have just a couple of minutes left. And I guess both of you have provided some really great resources, right? Like the website and talking about Cornell. But if someone were just starting and they have an existing curriculum, and this also is for you, Carl, or whomever, where would you recommend that they start? Like, what are some of the very basics that they can do so it's not as overwhelming as having to revamp the entire course? Where would you just kind of drill down for starters?
I think the largest impact could be just looking at your existing assignments and figuring out how you can provide more autonomy for students to choose different sub areas or certain focuses within your assignments. I think that is kind of the smaller scale part, because when you look at your course as a whole and the content, that becomes very overwhelming at times. So just looking at those assignments and thinking about offering students the ability to engage a little bit differently, choose a different mode, or choose a different focus within it is a good starting place.
And I would say diversifying syllabi is where we should all start. And this was something that was also last year, there was a few of us that took the ACAD decentering whiteness in the curriculum training as well, which was also something that was very much addressed there. But just looking at the resources you're providing your students and making sure that they do not come from one view, do not come from one culture, do not come from one person, right? Like making sure that they're a very expanded view on whatever the topic is that is being studied, and making sure that you're also providing those in different modalities for students to consume. I think that's like a very easy starting point in how we can all make our syllabi more inclusive, and also make it more focused on the UDL principles.
Thank you. Carl, did you have anything that you wanted to add in the last 30 seconds?
Just to reinforce, I think both those points in terms of both the autonomy and the diversity of perspectives, I think go hand in hand when we're really student centered in our approach, and providing that level of autonomy and allowing students to make it their own and construct their own learning, I think is really one of the things that I keep hearing over and over in this conversation, and really appreciate the dialogue.